By the end of the afternoon, 4 men would quietly leave a Hong Kong gym without finishing what they came to prove. No injuries were reported. No police were called. What remained was something harder to dismiss, a silence that settled over the room, and a reputation that never needed defending again. Witnesses say it lasted less than 2 minutes. They agree on the outcome. They disagree on how it happened. What they remember most is not the movement, but the restraint, and the certainty that once it began, it was already decided. Pause. The room was not built for spectators. It was narrow, practical, and faintly uneven underfoot, the kind of space where attention naturally turns inward. The walls carried the marks of repetition, scuffed paint, darkened corners, the quiet residue of years spent correcting posture rather than impressing visitors. There were no banners announcing achievement, no trophies, no mirrors arranged to flatter movement. Witnesses remember the air as still, not ceremonial, simply undisturbed. This was a working gym in Hong Kong during a period when martial reputation was still passed hand to hand, not printed or recorded. A place where instruction happened daily, and challenges, when they came, were handled without notice. If there were rules, they were unspoken. You entered respectfully. You trained honestly. You left having learned something, even if you did not know what it was yet. At the center of the room, there was space. Not an empty space, but a kept one, cleared deliberately, like a table before a task. That space belonged to Bruce Lee, though he rarely stood in it unless necessary. Most days he moved among students quietly, correcting angles with a touch, adjusting distance with a step, speaking only when silence no longer worked. Those who trained there say authority was not declared. It was assumed, then confirmed slowly over time. Bruce Lee was not large by comparison to many who passed through the doors. He did not dress to signal rank. He did not raise his voice to claim control of the room. His presence registered differently. It sharpened attention. People stood a little straighter without being told. Movements became smaller, more precise, as if excess had nowhere to hide. There was no sense of preparation that day, no announcement, no clearing of schedules. Training had begun as usual. Forms were practiced. Corrections were given. Breathing settled into rhythm. The room followed its normal pattern, which is why what came later felt so definitive to those who witnessed it. One student later said the room already had rules before anyone arrived to test them. Not written rules, environmental ones. Here, noise did not equal strength. Here, speed was less important than timing. Here, effort was expected, but waste was noticed immediately. These were not philosophies spoken aloud. They were habits enforced by repetition, by stopping a student mid-motion and asking them to do less, not more, by allowing mistakes to resolve themselves rather than correcting them publicly, by demonstrating control without spectacle. When people entered this room, they felt it quickly. Some adjusted, some resisted. A few mistook restraint for absence. On that afternoon, the room did not change to meet what was coming. It remained exactly as it was, and that, witnesses say, is what made the outcome inevitable, long before anyone understood they were watching history begin. The first sign of change was not movement, but posture. Those already inside the gym noticed it before a word was spoken, the subtle tightening that happens when unfamiliar intent enters a familiar space. 4 men stepped in together, not loudly, not aggressively, but deliberately close, as if distance itself were something to be negotiated. They did not bow. Witnesses recalled that none of them looked around with curiosity. Their attention was fixed forward, already narrowed. This was not a visit. It was a declaration made without announcement. At the time, public challenges were not uncommon in Hong Kong. Schools tested one another quietly, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of suspicion. A teacher's reputation could travel faster than explanation, and when it traveled too far, someone would eventually come to see if it held weight. This group had come with an assumption, not that they would necessarily win, but that numbers alone would equalize whatever skill they might face. 4 against 1 suggested fairness, not excess, in their minds. They did not address the room. They addressed Bruce Lee directly. There was no formal challenge spoken, no ritualized language, just a statement of intent delivered plainly. They had heard claims, they had questions, they were there to resolve both. The room stayed quiet. Students along the walls did not move. No one intervened. This was not because they felt threatened, but because they understood something the visitors did not. Responses in this space were not rushed, and explanations were rarely verbal. Bruce Lee did not rise immediately. Witnesses emphasized this detail. He did not stand to meet the challenge as a signal of readiness. He finished what he was doing, correcting a student's stance, adjusting the angle of a shoulder, returning attention where it already was. Only when that was complete did he turn. When he did, there was no visible change in him, no tightening of jaw, no shift in breathing. He did not size them up in the way men expect to be measured. He simply acknowledged their presence. The imbalance was obvious. 4 men, all trained, all prepared to prove something. 1 teacher, unaccompanied, already known, with nothing left to establish. The challengers mistook this stillness for hesitation. They believed the moment required escalation. They leaned into it, not with threats, but with proximity. A half-step closer, a testing of space. Bruce Lee did not step back. He did not step forward either. Those watching would later say this was the moment the challenge technically failed, before anything physical occurred. The authority in the room did not respond to pressure by matching it. It simply remained unchanged. Someone at the back of the gym recalls thinking there would be words next. There were none, only a pause. And in that pause, the challengers committed themselves to an outcome they no longer controlled. The room did not fill suddenly. It accumulated. One by one, people stopped what they were doing. A form left unfinished. A stretch held longer than necessary. Someone near the door stepped aside instead of leaving. No signal was given, yet the perimeter of the space widened almost on its own. Word did not spread outward, it spread inward. Those present understood that nothing dramatic was expected, but that something decisive was unavoidable. This was not curiosity, it was recognition, the kind that arrives when a situation can no longer dissolve on its own. No one raised a voice. The challengers stood in a loose line now, not by plan, but by instinct. They had not agreed on roles, only on intent. Each waited for the others to move first. The silence stretched long enough to expose this hesitation. Across from them, Bruce Lee remained still. Witnesses consistently note how little he occupied the space visually. His stance was neutral. His hands rested where they always did. There was no posture meant to intimidate, no preparatory motion to announce readiness. This absence of signals unsettled the challengers more than aggression would have. In most confrontations, tension rises through escalation, gestures, words, visible commitment. Here, tension accumulated through restraint. Every second without movement forced the challengers to remain with their own assumptions. They had come prepared for resistance. They had not prepared for indifference. A student later said it felt like watching weight settle onto a surface that did not bend. The public nature of the moment mattered, not because of crowd size, but because of witnesses. Reputation in that era did not depend on headlines, it depended on memory, on how many people could say, truthfully, I was there. That knowledge pressed inward on the challengers. They were no longer testing a man alone. They were testing a room that had already accepted him. One of them shifted his feet. It was a small adjustment, but it broke the equilibrium. Movement had finally entered the space, and with it, inevitability. The others followed, not forward yet, but inward, committing themselves psychologically, if not physically. Bruce Lee did not mirror the shift. He waited until the tension belonged entirely to them. Those closest say they felt it then. A subtle change, not in posture, but in attention, as if the room itself had narrowed, as if excess possibility had been removed. No one recalls a signal to begin, only that, at some point, the challengers realized the silence was no longer neutral. It was permission, and once taken, it could not be returned. No one agrees on who moved first. Some say one of the challengers stepped in too close, mistaking stillness for delay. Others believe it began with a reach, testing distance, nothing more. What all witnesses agree on is that once motion appeared, it did not unfold the way anyone expected. There was no opening display, no stance taken to be admired, no widening of space. The distance closed immediately. Bruce Lee did not retreat to create room. He entered the space the challengers believed belonged to them, not forcefully, efficiently, as if distance itself were the only problem being addressed. What followed is difficult to recount because it resisted narrative structure. There was no sequence of strikes that could be numbered, no rise and fall of momentum. Instead, there was a compression of time. Movement happened, but it was contained, short, economical, final. One witness said it felt less like a fight and more like an interruption, each attempt by the challengers to establish rhythm cut off before it could form. Another described it as watching plans disappear mid-thought. Bruce Lee did not chase. He did not pursue advantage once it appeared. He removed options. Hands moved only as far as necessary. Footwork adjusted by inches, not steps. When contact occurred, it ended exchanges rather than extended them. Not with visible damage, but with displacement. Balance taken, posture broken, direction redirected. One challenger found himself turned sideways without understanding how. Another stumbled back, not struck hard, but placed exactly where standing no longer worked. A third froze, momentarily unsure whether to advance or withdraw. The fourth never entered fully. This detail matters to those who were present. At no point did all four engage at once, not because they were prevented physically, but because the space no longer allowed it. Their timing dissolved, their confidence staggered. Bruce Lee remained centered, not geographically, but structurally. Wherever pressure appeared, it collapsed inward. Wherever force was offered, it was shortened, absorbed, and returned without emphasis. There was no visible anger. Breathing did not change. The room stayed quiet, not out of shock, but because there was nothing to respond to. No dramatic falls, no shouted commands, only the sound of feet adjusting on the floor and bodies realizing one by one that intention alone was insufficient. Witnesses say the entire exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. They measure it not by clocks, but by memory, by how quickly certainty drained from the challenger's movements, by how suddenly effort looked heavy and unnecessary. When it ended, it did not conclude with a final blow. It simply stopped. Bruce Lee stepped back, not to signal victory, but because there was nothing left to address. The challengers stood where they were, breathing harder now, not injured, but unmistakably displaced. The silence returned. Only this time it carried understanding. No one fell to the floor and stayed there. This is the detail witnesses insist on when the story is retold. There was no dramatic ending that allowed the challengers to explain their departure as misfortune or chance. No visible injury that could be blamed for what followed. They were standing when it ended. That is what made it difficult. The challengers looked at one another first, not at Bruce Lee. This brief exchange, glances rather than words, marked the true conclusion. They were not assessing damage. They were reassessing assumptions. What they had brought into the room no longer fit. One of them adjusted his sleeve, a small habitual gesture that had nothing to do with combat. Another exhaled slowly, as if only then realizing he had been holding his breath. The third avoided eye contact altogether. The fourth, who had never fully entered, remained near the edge, unchanged physically, but visibly diminished. No challenge was restated. No demand was made. No excuse offered. The room did not react. Students did not cheer. No one spoke. This absence of response mattered. It denied the challengers even the consolation of having created a spectacle. What had occurred did not require commentary. Bruce Lee did not address them. Witnesses note this with particular clarity. He did not explain what had happened. He did not correct their mistakes. He did not offer advice publicly or privately. To do so would have framed the encounter as instruction. It was not. It was a demonstration of boundaries. The challengers understood this before anyone else did. One by one, they stepped back, not hurriedly, not defiantly, simply acknowledging that the space no longer belonged to them. They bowed on the way out, not deeply, not ceremonially, but enough to signal recognition. The door closed without emphasis. Only after they left did the room begin to breathe again. Movement resumed cautiously at first. A student retrieved something from the floor that had been dropped earlier. Another returned to a position along the wall. Training continued. This continuation, witnesses say, was the final dismantling of the challenge. Nothing had been disrupted enough to require recovery. No energy needed to be restored. The environment returned to itself as if correcting a brief imbalance. Later, some students would admit feeling unsettled, not by violence, but by how little of it had been required. What they had witnessed did not align with the stories they had grown up hearing about strength. There was no triumph to imitate, only absence of resistance, of excess, of anything unnecessary. The challengers left without being defeated in the way men expect to be. And that, years later, is what many believe followed them the longest. The story did not travel quickly. There were no written accounts, no formal records. Nothing was submitted, archived, or announced. What existed instead were fragments, conversations recalled years later, moments described differently depending on who was speaking and why. Yet the outcome never changed. 4 men entered a gym to test something. They left without finishing the test. As time passed, the method blurred. Movements were argued over. Distances were misremembered. Some claimed speed. Others claimed timing. A few insisted it must have been strength after all, disguised somehow. But those who were present rarely corrected these interpretations. They focused on what followed. In the months after the incident, fewer challenges came, not because the story grew larger, but because it grew quieter. People arrived to train, not to test. Questions were asked carefully. Assumptions were left at the door. The gym itself did not change. The teaching did not harden. If anything, it became more restrained. Students noticed that Bruce Lee spoke even less about confrontation afterward. He emphasized efficiency through correction, not comparison. Forms became shorter. Movements were reduced, refined, stripped of decoration. No reference was made to the incident. Years later, when some of the students had become teachers themselves, the story surfaced again, not as a boast, but as a reference point, a reminder of what authority looks like when it does not need reinforcement. Those who retold it did so carefully. They spoke of the silence, of the absence of effort, of how nothing had been taken, only revealed. One former challenger, encountered much later by chance, reportedly described it without bitterness. He did not name Bruce Lee directly. He said only that he had once mistaken noise for certainty, and certainty for strength. The lesson, if there was one, was never stated outright. It lived in how the room had behaved, in how restraint had outlasted confrontation, in how the event resisted spectacle and survived anyway. Decades on, the story remains incomplete by design. It refuses to become instruction. It resists reenactment. What endures is not the image of a man overcoming 4 others. It is the memory of 4 men realizing, almost simultaneously, that nothing in front of them needed to prove itself. And in that realization, history did not announce itself. It simply stayed.